Hi, everyone. Welcome to your third lecture for Communicating Through Form. This week, I'm going to do things a little bit differently. Um, I'm actually going to not have a transcript. So you're going to hear a lot more ums and ahs. I'm going to see if I can just get through this based on the images that I see. This week, I'm also going to probably aim to have a second lecture up early next week, so around Monday or Tuesday, just because I have a lot of material that I want to cover, and it's thematically can be broken up into two clean chunks. But I thought it was really important to get this one up ASAP, especially as we enter into our first assignment. So welcome to Communicating Through Form, lecture number 3. The topic of this lecture today is going to be play. Now, what do I mean by play? Play is a behavior that is performed in order to enjoy the capacity of being able to perform it. So that's a little confusing and circular. What I mean by that is play is a behavior that we do not in order to achieve a different end, but because we like to do it. It may be enjoyed in isolation, staged before a public, or compared with that of competitors in a contest. So we're talking about this is something that you can do alone. This is something you can do in front of an audience, or this is something that you can do with friends. So it's the difference between sports versus drawing versus maybe staging a play itself. But what we're talking about today is we're talking about it in an art and design context. And what that means is we're talking about how do we develop creative practices that inform what we make as designers, and not only inform what we make, but inform us in a way so that we enjoy the things that we do. So personally, I like to draw a bit, but I really like to code. I like to develop kind of weird interfaces. And so I always make sure that I have time to sort of play with things and not just have to frantically reach towards doing things based on sort of a client or an external force. And I think that's the difference between play and work. There are sort of, according to Peter Huizinga, who was an early theorist of play in the 20th century, there are sort of 5 key aspects to play, and we're going to list them out here. Play is free, in fact, freedom. So play is the types of things that is completely distinct from work. So play is an opportunity where you don't actually have the strictures that are imposed on you by external forces. You can have internal strictures for sure, and you can set up the conditions for your own kinds of play, as you'll see a lot of the work that I reference does that, but it's not, it's a freeing activity as opposed to one that's bound. Play is not ordinary or real life. That play is a thing that you do aside from work. It's something that you do outside of your work. Play is distinct from ordinary life, both as to locality and duration. So the time that you set aside for play distinguishes it from the rest of your life, just as maybe the place that you do play. So if I have a workspace, that's my area for play. For kids, that's often kids have a playroom. My child has specific areas throughout the entire house that she has collections of toys, collections of books. They're soft areas. Play creates order, is order. Play demands order absolute and supreme. That in some ways there's no wild grammar to play, that the kind of play that you do always has its own logic. And lastly, play is connected with no material interest, and no profit can be gained from it. So this last one is a little bit more complicated, because what we're going to be talking about today is the ways that you can inform your professional practice and your artistic practice and designerly practice through activities that you establish for yourself. So with some examples, what I want to talk about today a little bit is some of the advantages of play. One of the things that play allows us to do is it allows us to become more familiar with the tools that we use. So this week recently we've been playing with Illustrator, and we've been playing with Photoshop. This is not sometimes what I'll do if I'm sort of multitasking, if I'm in a meeting, if I'm listening to something, I'll open up Illustrator and I'll just make things on the screen. This is a kind of play, and that kind of play allows me to sort of deepen my understanding of what I can and can't do with my tools. These are some selections from the Instagram feed of Siberia 2020, Siberia_2020. You can see the name there. What this is this is the Instagram feed of a designer named David Schnittman, who every day does a new sketch in the program processing, p5.js. And all of these are computer generated artwork sketches. Some of them are animated, some of them are not. And he allots himself a little bit of time every day. And the whole purpose of this is to become better with to learn processing, to master processing some more. So in some ways, it's like practicing the piano, but the output is every week he does a sketch. Another example of this is Alberto Mas, who is a 3D effects artist who deals with a lot of rendering engines. So he makes these beautiful, like very short, quick, absurdist, sometimes grotesque animations, and he will post these regularly. These are kind of forms of play. There's no client. There's no one who needs this specific project. Instead, what it's for is just to invite users, or to invite his own practice. And what he does is whenever he's made a sketch, he posts it on Instagram. Other artists who I like who do this is the collage artist Anna Blue Kleiwer. She is a collage artist. So this is everything that you're seeing is just using a X-Acto knife and old magazines that she'll cut up and combine together to make into these beautiful, kind of strange, surreal collage pieces. Another advantage to play on top of familiarity with tools is unexpected results. This is, I think I showed this last week as well. This is an image by Daniel Eatock. And what he likes to do is he likes to play with sort of blotter paper and markers. And so here's an image of him setting this up. And this is one of his resulting prints. The idea behind this is that he doesn't know how the markers are going to necessarily interact with paper, but what he ends up creating are these beautiful color pieces, these really lush, luminescent color pieces. Or this interactive exhibition piece of moire lines that Practice Studio makes, where they create these beautiful lightbox tables with various patterns on them. And what happens is that students or children or adults are invited to move these different transparencies over each other to create different kinds of moire patterns. You can see what happens when you layer multiple patterns on top of each other. Really exciting things start to happen. Another example of the sort of excitement of play is process discovery. Zach Lieberman, who's for many creative coders is really a kind of key inspiring figure, regularly posts and explores different ways of using his creative coding platform called Open Frameworks. And one of the things he started to play with is augmented reality. And as a result, he developed an application called Weird Type. And sort of after he had been playing with all of these little AR configurations, he released this little app that everyone started to enjoy. And that became sort of integral to his process. And his process is a lot like the one that I showed earlier, Siberia 2020. His process is every day he gives himself half an hour to develop one singular sketch. And then he posts that sketch on Instagram. Another more analog process is the designer Carol Martins, who looks for random pieces of bits and metal and sort of garbage that are discarded and then puts them into a letterpress printer and uses them as mediums to print ink over and create these really beautiful printed artifacts. The other thing that I really think is important and the sort of major advantage of play is that it breaks the homework model. Sort of when somebody asks you to, when I ask you to fulfill an assignment, sometimes you can approach that people can approach that without much passion. But if you have a really strong sense of play in your practice, you can very quickly find your own ways of making things and your own way of attacking the sort of questions that's exciting and engaging for you, so that you're not simply just making something because you've been asked to make it for the grade, if you will. This is a project by a former student of mine named Roxanne Nash. Roxanne, as part of her thesis project, she was looking at her own history of the internet. And one of the things she found was this 3D constructed universe that you could build that were sort of these 3D chat rooms called Habbo Hotel. And she went back on them after, many, many years being away from them, after being like a decade away from Habbo Hotel. And she started to build these interactive spaces and start to play with them as a designer. And she ended up making these big, gigantic, crazy, beautiful posters and that she sort of created. Or Meet Studio, who's a Beijing / Toronto-based studio that looks for the vernacular typography wherever they go, and uses that and pulls that into their own typographic practice. Or the designer Micah Barrett, who I feel like I've learned so much from in the way that he will explore a tool set like Illustrator or InDesign, and will idly play with it at all times of the day or night until he finds a new process or a new method or a new visual form, and then start to develop specific kinds of compositions out of them. So this is a letterpress printed business, like holiday or greeting card that was designed out of sort of the experimentation and play that he does in Illustrator. In short, I think that play, especially for the designer and the artist, is itself a form of research. Now, oftentimes people break play into two categories. You have structured play and you have unstructured play. Structured play is the kind of play where you're working towards an end goal, whereas unstructured play is that sort of more open-ended play where you don't necessarily know what you're doing. Let's take a look at an example of unstructured play. This is the sketchbook of the designer named Evelyn Kazakov. Evelyn Kazakov, at an early age, tried to find a way to integrate her design practice with her sewing practice. So what you're seeing in these sketchbooks are images of photographs, little bits of color swatches, and pieces of thread that she had saved. Now, as she started to work through this, she started to stitch into the paper itself. And when this was revealed to me, I thought this was such an interesting moment. What we have on this page is the words, "Why am I doing this?" I always love that statement because to me, this is a real moment revealing the glory and the joy of unstructured play, when you sort of are making something, but you have no idea where the end goal ends up being. But what she ended up doing, this is everything that she does now, is she started to, her unstructured play led her down this path, deeper and deeper and deeper into this act of stitching colors and exploring the possibility of pattern. Now her practice is very much about stitching. So she is hired by clients to be a sort of graphic designer who uses sewing as the medium, who uses embroidery as the medium to make really exciting contemporary design that borrows from the history of print culture. And this is the pivot from unstructured play, which is play where you don't necessarily know what you're doing or where you're going, into structured play. That idea of working towards an end goal. Here's an example of something that might be considered a little more structured. For many years, Jessica Heish, the graphic designer, had a typographic practice called Daily Drop Cap, where every day she would draw one extremely ornate letter. And these illustrations would culminated into an alphabet. So she had a very rigid structure for her daily practice, that the first day would be A, the second day would be B, but still it was distinct from her actual paid creative practice at the time. Another example that I always like to show is the concept of Fish World by Arthur Kiley. This is an image of Arthur Kiley's, the beginning of his complete cut paper universe from when he was a child, called Fish World. It was a sprawling It was a sprawling 3D space in his house that was entirely made out of cut paper. Here are some more images of it. Actually, that's the second image, the first image repeated, but you can see how the level of detail that went into Fish World. And if you notice closely, you can see there are actual little fish figurines inside the world in the second one. And Anther, as a child, would look around and find different textures and different artifacts in the world, and he would recreate them out of paper. Today, Anther has pivoted the Fish World practice into an actual product that he sells on the internet called card kits, which are these cut paper templates that you can buy that you can assemble into this miniature world. So how do we set the conditions for play? So here are some distinct directions or pieces of advice for developing a practice for creating playful forms. So one of the ways that you set the conditions for play is through materials. This is an image of Nancy Skolos piling up one of the many posters in the poster practice she works with her husband with, Nancy Skolos and Tom Waddell. And her practice their practice has always been about has always been a very specific structured process where they collage quickly for a few minutes, and then they take their favorite collage and then they reproduce that collage out of like big sculptural pieces, and then they photograph that and then they layer it up with designed elements. Their materials then become those pieces of magazine that have been chopped up. That becomes the materials that they sort of build their entire practice out of. Another important aspect of play is schedule. This is examples of the walking project by Mitch Goldstein, who every day allots himself a specific amount of time to experiment with materials, just experiment with a pile of things that he has and develop photograms and photographs of his collages, of his ink smears, and every day creates a very short, discrete image, and that unto itself becomes its own thing. Another example is tools. These are some of the experimental posters by the poster printing company out of the Midwest called Aesthetic Apparatus. And one of the things that they do is they do a lot of posters for bands and a lot of posters for many different like kind of like in the music scene. But one of the things that they do is they're screen printers, is whenever they have an extra screen, they will overprint the multiple extra prints onto themselves so that they have these sheets of purely chaotic prints that are typically called make-readies. But because they have a distinctive visual style, these assembled make-readies themselves become really, really compelling. Ideas. I mean, one thing that's really one fun thing to do is you can play with your physical material, but you can also play with your conceptual material. John Sueda and Chris Hamamoto have for years had this ongoing practice of generating flags, where they're constantly taking apart the little bits of flags and then using various systems to randomly reassemble them. It's called Flag Generator. They've done this using a risograph printer, like these two. They've done it with a flag. They have computer programs. They have websites that generate flags, that randomly generate these flags. So the idea is, there's the idea that they're playing with, and they're just constantly pushing it through multiple media formats. So with all of this in mind, this week, one of the things that I'd like you to try doing is start looking at ways of playing. For this next assignment, you've been assigned a singular letter. And what I want you to do is to pick some of the words from that vocabulary of form and start experimenting with different methods of playing in terms of creating that letter. Try structured and unstructured methods of play. Here's an image of a letter. Eventually, we're not going to have a full alphabet, but eventually what we're going to do is everyone's going to have a singular letter, and we're going to assemble those singular letters into something a little bit more meaningful. So that's all I have this week. Oh, no, not yet. So as you're thinking about playing, think about using all of the different methods that you have at your fingertips. If you want to play with drawing, try drawing. If you want to try photography, you can take photos and you can bring them into Photoshop or Illustrator. You can collage if you'd like to collage. You can use Illustrator. You can try painting. You can try scanning, carving, ink, 3D software, sewing, shadows, whatever you want. But the point is that try and explore 4 distinct directions, 4 methods of play, plus 4, each one should have its own associated term. And next week, what you're going to have is a set of rough drafts, and we're going to actually devote next week to a critique time so that we can talk about which ones are working and which ones you can refine to the final form. So that's what I have today, short but sweet. And we will see you, I will see you next week. All right, take care.